In 1827, the population of Baltimore was 80,000 people, and roughly two-thirds of them earned their living from commerce. That same year, 22,000 of them, nearly 1 in every 4 residents, men, women, and children counted together, bought stock in a single company. Not a bank, not a shipping firm, a railroad that didn't exist yet, running to a river 400 miles away that none of them had ever seen. That was Baltimore, a city that bet on itself so aggressively, so collectively, that when you look at the numbers, you'd swear the whole town had lost its mind. But the thing is, the bet paid off. For a while, it paid off spectacularly. The place barely existed a century before that wager. In 1752, the settlement that the Maryland General Assembly had authorized back in 1729 consisted of 27 buildings, a church, 2 taverns, and 24 homes sitting on a slope above the Patapsco River. The land had been purchased from Charles and Daniel Carroll, 40 shillings an acre, payable in coin or tobacco, warehoused with the county sheriff. The Carroll family had named the price, and the commissioners who bought it on behalf of the colonial government thought it was fair. 60 acres of harbor frontage for the equivalent of what a merchant might spend on a decent suit of clothes. That purchase, transacted with such casualness, would eventually anchor the 6th largest city in America. What made Baltimore grow wasn't elegance or planning, it was geography and flower. The town sat at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, the deepest navigable harbor on the mid-Atlantic coast, and just inland the streams tumbled off the Piedmont with enough force to turn mill wheels. By the 1780s, Baltimore was grinding wheat from the rich farmland of Maryland and Pennsylvania and shipping flour to the Caribbean and to Europe. The port that had been chartered in 1706 for the tobacco trade, a crop that exhausted the soil and was already declining, reinvented itself around grain. The money followed. Between 1790 and 1800, the population nearly doubled, jumping from 13,000 to more than 26,000. By 1810, Baltimore was the 3rd largest city in America, behind only New York and Philadelphia. It had briefly served as the nation's capital, too, for a few weeks in the winter of 1776 to 1777, when the Continental Congress fled Philadelphia ahead of the British and convened at the Henry Fight House near the harbor. Then came the moment that gave Baltimore its anthem, literally. On September 13, 1814, during the War of 1812, the British fleet bombarded Fort McHenry at the mouth of the harbor for 25 hours straight. The city's citizen defenders held. Francis Scott Key, watching from a ship in the harbor, wrote the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner. Though Congress wouldn't make it the national anthem until 1931, the battle mattered strategically. It stopped the British campaign to take Baltimore after they'd already burned Washington, but it mattered symbolically even more. Baltimore had fought for itself and won. That self-reliance, that chip-on-the-shoulder defiance would show up again and again in the city's story. And it was during those years of flower and ambition that a Massachusetts-born merchant named George Peabody arrived in town. He was 20 years old in 1815, a dry goods trader who had come south to chase opportunity. Baltimore became his proving ground, the place where he learned wholesale commerce, where he built the trading network that would eventually make him, from his later base in London, the wealthiest American alive. But Peabody remembered where he'd started. In 1857, he sent $300,000, roughly $10 million in today's money, back to Baltimore with instructions to build something he called the Peabody Institute. A library, a lecture hall, a music conservatory, an art gallery. He wanted it to be free, open to the citizens of the city that had given him his start. The white marble building that Edmund George Lynn designed for it wouldn't open until 1866, delayed by the Civil War, but when Peabody himself crossed the Atlantic to speak at the dedication, standing on the front steps before the Washington Monument, not the one in the Capitol, but the original, the 178-foot Doric column that Robert Mills designed in 1829, the first major monument to George Washington anywhere in the country. He was looking out at a city that had already proven something remarkable about itself. It could build institutions that outlasted the fortunes that paid for them. But even before Peabody's marble halls opened, Baltimore had made its most consequential bet. That railroad. On February 12, 1827, about 25 men gathered at the home of a banker named George Brown. Most of them were merchants. They'd been watching New York celebrate the Erie Canal, which had opened 2 years earlier, and they understood exactly what it meant. Goods from the interior could now reach the coast through New York instead of Baltimore. If they didn't act, the trade would shift north permanently. Their answer was audacious. They wouldn't dig a canal. They'd build something almost no one had ever attempted at commercial scale, a railroad stretching from Baltimore's harbor to the Ohio River across the Appalachian Mountains. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was chartered on February 28, 1827. The state of Maryland invested $1 million. The city of Baltimore invested $500,000 more. The rest, another $1.5 million, was sold to those 22,000 private citizens in shares that opened at the Mechanics Bank on March 20th and closed 12 days later. Construction began on July 4, 1828, with an elaborate ceremony. They invited Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence, to lay the first stone at Mount Clair. He was 90 years old. According to the accounts, Carroll said it was the most important act of his life since signing the Declaration itself. Whether he actually said it or the newspapers polished the quote, it captured the mood. Baltimore believed it was doing something historic, and Baltimore was right. The first 13 miles of track from Baltimore to Ellicott's Mills opened on May 24, 1830. Horses pulled the early cars, but that same year, a Baltimore inventor and industrialist named Peter Cooper built a small steam locomotive called the Tom Thumb and ran it on the B&O line to demonstrate that steam could handle the sharp curves and steep grades of the route. The famous race between the Tom Thumb and a horse-drawn car, which the horse actually won after the engine blew a belt, proved the concept anyway. By 1831, the railroad had switched to steam. By Christmas Eve, 1852, it reached the Ohio River at Wheeling, 379 miles from Baltimore, 14 tunnels and 114 bridges through the Alleghenies, the first railroad to connect the Atlantic seaboard to the interior of the continent. The money cascaded back. Under the presidency of John Work Garrett, who ran the B&O from 1858 to 1884, gross earnings climbed from $4 million a year to more than $10 million during the Civil War alone. The stock price rose from $57 a share to $200. By the time Garrett died, the railroad operated over 1,700 miles of track and had become the economic spine of the city. Its Mount Clair shops, where the first B&O cars were built, employed thousands. The roundhouse that architect E. Francis Baldwin designed there in 1884, a magnificent iron and brick structure, still stands today as the centerpiece of the B&O Railroad Museum. But in those years, it wasn't a museum. It was a factory floor, loud with the clang of metal and the hiss of steam, turning out the machines that were turning Baltimore into a national power, and power it was becoming. Baltimore also held a distinction in American religious history. In 1789, it became the seat of the first Roman Catholic diocese in the United States, and the Basilica of the Assumption, designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe and completed in 1821, was the nation's first Catholic cathedral, a building whose dome and classical proportions rivaled anything in Washington. The city accumulated firsts the way some cities accumulate parking lots. First umbrella factory, first ice cream manufacturer, first dental school at the University of Maryland in 1840. First telegraph message, sent along the B&O right-of-way from Washington to Baltimore by Samuel Morse on May 24, 1844. First commercially operated electric streetcar in 1885. These weren't coincidences. They were symptoms of a city where capital, labor, and ambition existed in concentrations high enough to produce combustion. In 1782, Lexington Market had begun as an informal gathering of farmers on the outskirts of town, selling produce on land donated by Colonel John Eager Howard from his estate called Belvedere. By the mid-19th century, it was the most famous public market in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson visited and called Baltimore the gastronomic capital of the world. The market grew along with the city. Oysters, crabs, terrapin, fruits, vegetables, meats, vendors from every immigrant community jostling for stall space. The city kept rents low on purpose, encouraging anyone with ambition and a cart to set up shop. Germans, Irish, Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, Italians. Between 1820 and 1930, nearly 2 million immigrants passed through Baltimore's port, the second largest point of entry in America after Ellis Island. By 1913, the city was averaging 40,000 new arrivals a year, and many of them found their first footing at a market stall or a factory bench. The factories were everywhere. The canneries lined the harbor, over 100 of them at the peak, processing oysters from the Chesapeake Bay, tomatoes and corn and peaches from the surrounding farmland. Baltimore earned the title Canning Capital of the World, and 3 major advances in canning technology came from Baltimore men. The garment industry filled the lofts above the downtown streets, turning out ready-made menswear that shipped across the country. Shipyards hammered along the waterfront at Fells Point, the old maritime neighborhood where Frederick Douglass had once worked as a caulker in the 1830s, learning to read in secret before escaping north to freedom and fame. And then came the steel. In 1887, an engineer named Frederick Wood looked at a marshy peninsula jutting into the Patapsco River just outside the city limits and saw a deep-water port. He persuaded the Pennsylvania Steel Company to buy the land, 385 acres of peach orchards belonging to the reluctant Fitzell family, and build a mill. By 1891, Sparrows Point was producing the first steel ever manufactured in Maryland. In 1916, Bethlehem Steel took over. Charles Schwab, Bethlehem's president, made the Hotel Belvedere his headquarters when he came to Baltimore in 1915 to spend $22 million expanding the plant. That number is worth pausing over. $22 million in 1915 at a single industrial site in a single city. The Belvedere itself had cost $1.75 million to build 12 years earlier, and that was considered a staggering sum. The Belvedere. It's worth lingering there a moment because the hotel tells you everything about what Baltimore thought of itself at the turn of the 20th century. 4 of the city's wealthiest families, the Browns, the Parrs, the Harveys, the Perrins, pooled their money and hired Parker and Thomas, a firm out of Baltimore and Boston, with one instruction: build the greatest hotel in the world. Spare no expense. What rose at the corner of Charles and Chase Streets in 1903 was an 11-story Beaux-Arts masterpiece in tan brick, 188 feet tall, with a French Second Empire mansard roof visible from half the city. 350 rooms. The official opening on December 14, 1903, was the social event of the season. Henry James stayed there and called it imposingly modern, yet quietly affable. Woodrow Wilson stayed during the 1912 Democratic Convention, 600 guests registered, cots filling the hallways, and won the nomination that made him president. Theodore Roosevelt stayed. Clark Gable stayed. Mary Pickford came in 1919 to sell war bonds at the 5th Regiment Armory and retired to the Belvedere afterward. When the Queen of Romania visited in 1926, the hotel staff hung a canopy of royal purple above the entrance, paneled her suite in silk, draped the elevators in the Romanian national colors, and installed an antique throne in the ballroom. That was the Belvedere. That was Baltimore at its peak, a city that could furnish a throne for a queen and not feel it was overreaching. And the Belvedere wasn't alone. Captain Isaac Emerson, who had made his fortune inventing bromo seltzer, the headache remedy that made his name a household word, and put a 357-foot tower topped with a revolving 51-foot bromo seltzer bottle on the Baltimore skyline, a tower modeled on the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, decided, according to legend, to build his own hotel after a waiter at the Belvedere asked him to put his jacket back on during a hot day. Emerson reportedly said he'd build a hotel where he could wear whatever he wanted. The Bromo Seltzer Tower, incidentally, was the tallest building in Baltimore when it was completed in 1911, and the revolving bottle on top, illuminated at night, visible for miles, was the largest electric sign in the world. It was removed in 1936 for structural reasons, but the tower itself still stands, now an artist's studio space. What arose from Emerson's sartorial grudge was the 18-story Emerson Hotel, 425 rooms, $1.5 million, designed by Joseph Sperry at the corner of Baltimore and Calvert Streets. The key tags were shaped like diamondback terrapins. The chandeliers in the basement Chesapeake room were decorated with crabs, oysters, and terrapins. On the roof garden, lovers danced to jazz through the 1920s, looking out over the Patapsco and the upper Chesapeake. The French chef they hired for the opening lasted about a month before Baltimoreans demanded he be fired and replaced with someone who could cook Maryland food. The Sun ran the headline, "French Chef Fired, Maryland Cooking in Demand." The Sun. There's another institution. Founded in 1837, it was the paper that gave Baltimore its voice, and the voice that emerged was like no other in American journalism. In 1906, a young Baltimore reporter named H.L. Mencken joined the paper as Sunday editor, beginning a nearly 50-year association that would make him the most influential journalist in the country. Walter Lippmann called him the most powerful personal influence on this whole generation of educated people. The New York Times called him the most powerful private citizen in America, and Mencken never left Baltimore. He wrote about the city with a mixture of affection and mockery that Baltimoreans recognized as love. He drank at the Belvedere. He cultivated friendships with the doctors at Johns Hopkins. He covered the political conventions and the boxing matches and the literary feuds. He was Baltimore's ID, its sharpest critic and its most loyal citizen. And he worked from a row house on Holland Street that today is a museum visited by almost no one. Speaking of Johns Hopkins, the man, not the university. Hopkins was a Quaker merchant who made his fortune in wholesale groceries and banking, then invested heavily in the B&O Railroad at a time when the stock was unfashionable. When he died in 1873, he left $7 million, the largest philanthropic bequest in American history up to that point, split evenly between a university and a hospital, both to bear his name. The university opened in 1876. The hospital opened in 1889. Together, they transformed Baltimore from a commercial city into a center of knowledge that would eventually employ more people than the steel mills ever did. But that transformation took a century, and during the decades between, the old Baltimore and the new Baltimore existed side by side, not always comfortably. Baltimore's hotel tradition, it should be said, went back much further than the Belvedere. In 1825, David Barnum opened his city hotel. 6 stories, 200 rooms, the most ambitious hotel in the country. Francis Trollope called Barnum's the most splendid in the Union. Charles Dickens, visiting later, praised it as one of the most comfortable hotels in America. Barnum set a standard for public hospitality that the city maintained for over a century through a succession of grand establishments. The Utah House in 1835, the Gilmore House, the Rennert in 1885 with its legendary bar and its back rooms where Democratic politicians cut deals over terrapin and rye whiskey. Each hotel was a public stage for the city's ambitions, a place where out-of-town money met local connections, where deals were made and reputations either burnished or ruined. When the Rennert was demolished in 1941, old Baltimore mourned it the way you mourn a friend who took some of your best stories with them. Before the Civil War, the city harbored another distinction that doesn't get mentioned enough. Baltimore was home to the largest free black community in the United States. Slavery in Maryland had been declining since the 1810s as the economy shifted away from plantation agriculture, and Baltimore's docks and shipyards offered employment that drew free blacks from across the region. Frederick Douglass lived in the city as an enslaved man in the 1830s, working as a shipcaulker in the Fells Point yards, teaching himself to read and write before escaping in 1838 disguised as a sailor. The city that held him in bondage was also, paradoxically, the city that gave him the tools to free himself, and eventually to become the most important voice for abolition in America. The Great Fire of 1904 could have ended everything. On Sunday morning, February 7th, a small blaze started in the basement of the John E. Hurst Dry Goods Warehouse at German Street and Hopkins Place. 2 explosions blew the roof off the building. Southwest winds carried the flames east and south. Fire companies came by train from Washington, Philadelphia, New York, even Wilmington, and discovered in one of those details that sounds too absurd to be true, that their hose couplings didn't fit Baltimore's hydrants. For 31 hours, the fire raged, eating 80 blocks, 140 acres, from the waterfront to Mount Vernon along Charles Street. More than 1,500 buildings were leveled. Another 1,000 were damaged. 35,000 people lost their jobs overnight. The property loss was estimated between $100 million and $150 million, somewhere north of $3.5 billion today. And somehow, no one died. Not a single confirmed fatality. which remains one of the most improbable facts in the history of American disasters. Mayor Robert McLean refused all outside financial aid. His quote made the papers the next morning: "Baltimore would take care of its own, thank you." Within a month, the Maryland General Assembly had created the Burnt District Commission with near-dictatorial powers to redesign and rebuild the destroyed area. The commission widened streets, buried electrical wires, dredged the harbor, and built a proper sewer system. Between 1904 and 1911, Baltimore voters approved bond issues totaling $50 million. 2 years after the fire, the Sun reported that the city had risen from the ashes. Most people agreed that the fire, terrible as it was, had been converted into an opportunity. The old downtown, with its colonial-era streets and tangled utility wires, was replaced by something modern and fireproof, and, the city hoped, permanent. That word, permanent. It floated over Baltimore through the first half of the 20th century. The Lord Baltimore Hotel opened on New Year's Eve, 1928. 700 rooms, 22 stories, the tallest building in the city, designed by William Lee Stoddard in the French Renaissance style. WBAL radio broadcast the opening. The copper mansard roof gleamed green against the sky. It was the last high-rise in Baltimore built with classical detailing, and it arrived just in time for the Depression. Over the next 3 years, more than 20 people jumped from the building. But Baltimore survived the Depression, as it had survived the fire. Bethlehem Steel rehired during the war buildup. By 1957, Sparrows Point was the largest steel plant in the world. 5 square miles of blast furnaces and rolling mills, 30,000 workers, plus another 4,000 in the adjacent shipyard. The steel from that plant went into the Golden Gate Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, the Empire State Building, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. It went into the Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic during World War II. Sparrows Point and the nearby Fairfield Yard built 2 of the first 14 ever launched. The Hippodrome Theater on Utah Street, designed by Thomas Lamb and opened in 1914 as the largest theater south of Philadelphia, was packing in 30,000 visitors a week by 1920. Frank Sinatra performed there with Harry James, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, the Andrews Sisters, Benny Goodman. They all played the Hippodrome, 3 shows a day during the good years. The 1930s brought it to receivership. A man named L. Edward Goldman bought the property and all its debts for the remarkable sum of $14,000, then hired a Philadelphian named Isidore Rappaport to manage it. Rappaport brought in new seats, a grand new marquee, and the caliber of acts that made the Hippodrome famous again. The streetcar system, which had begun in 1859 with horse-drawn cars running from Broadway to North Avenue for 3 cents a fare, had become a vast electric network by the early 20th century. Baltimore operated the first commercially successful electric streetcar in America, running from Howard Street to Hampton in 1885. The first nickel fare collected on that line is now at the Smithsonian Institution. By mid-century, the trolleys connected every corner of the city. You could ride from Liberty Heights to Stewart's department store on Howard Street, or from Highlandtown to Dundalk for a nickel. The system was not segregated, one of the few public spaces in the city where black and white Baltimoreans shared the same seats. At the peak, during the Second World War, the whole machine was running flat out. The canneries were processing food for the military. The shipyards at Sparrows Point and Bethlehem Fairfield were building Liberty cargo ships, 384 of them at Fairfield alone, at a pace that astonished even the federal planners who'd commissioned them. The population swelled with war workers, black and white alike, many from the rural South. Streetcar ridership hit an all-time high because gasoline was rationed and automobiles couldn't be bought. The city was loud and crowded and fully employed, and no one had time to notice that this was the summit. And then, the population peaked in 1950 at 949,708. The 6th largest city in the country, nearly 1 million people. What happened next didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen for any single reason, which is what makes it hard to tell as a story and what makes it true. The streetcars went first. In 1948, National City Lines, a consortium backed by General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, in what would later be called the Great American Streetcar Scandal, took control of the Baltimore Transit Company and began replacing electric trolleys with diesel buses. The economics were straightforward, at least on paper. Buses didn't require track maintenance or overhead wires. But the streetcars had done something buses never could. They had shaped the city. Neighborhoods like Edmondson Village and Roland Park had been built specifically along trolley lines, designed for residents who would ride downtown to work. The trolley wasn't just transportation. It was the organizing principle of the city itself. Remove it, and the logic of the neighborhoods began to dissolve. The trackless trolleys ended in 1959. The last streetcar ran on November 3, 1963, on Route 8 from Catonsville to Towson. The tracks were paved over. The overhead wires came down. A transit system that had enabled an entire city to function without cars was dismantled in 15 years. The highways came. The federal government was subsidizing mortgages in the suburbs through the GI Bill and the FHA, and building the interstates that made the suburbs reachable. White families moved to Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County and kept moving. A state constitutional amendment passed in 1948 required a vote of residents in any area proposed for annexation to Baltimore, which effectively froze the city's boundaries at their 1918 limits. This was the quiet catastrophe. Every other growing American city could expand its borders outward, annexing the new suburbs, keeping the tax base within city limits. Baltimore could not. The people who left still worked in the city, still used its roads and its harbor, but their property taxes went to the counties. This was the structural flaw that had been embedded in the arrangement all along, invisible during the years of growth, fatal during the years of decline. The breweries went too, though almost no one noticed at the time. Baltimore had been a brewing city since the 1800s, over 100 breweries in its past, driven by the enormous German immigrant population. National Bohemian, the beer of Baltimore, the beer you drank at Memorial Stadium while the Orioles played and the Colts played and the city still had two major professional sports teams. By the 1970s, the local breweries had been bought by national companies or simply closed. Another industry gone, another set of buildings dark. The black population of Baltimore, which had been 23.8% in 1950, grew to 46.4% by 1970, driven by the Great Migration from the South and by white flight from the city. Blockbusting real estate agents accelerated the turnover, buying houses cheap from white families they'd frightened with rumors of integration, then selling them dear to black families desperate for decent housing. Neighborhoods that had been white for generations became all black within a few years. The schools resegregated by geography. The April 1968 riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. burned through the commercial corridors of West Baltimore, and many of the businesses that were destroyed never returned. The Emerson Hotel closed in 1969. It was demolished in 1971. The site at Baltimore and Calvert became a bank building. The Rennert Hotel, which had been the city's premier political clubhouse, had already been demolished in 1941. The Altamont went in 1965. The movie theaters along Howard Street closed one by one. The Century, the Valencia, both demolished in 1961 for Charles Center, an office complex. The Mayfair in 1965. The Stanley, demolished the same year. The Howard, gone by 1980. Between 1900 and 1970, approximately 235 movie theaters opened and closed in Baltimore. The Hippodrome lasted until 1990, the final movie house in downtown, showing films to smaller and smaller audiences in a 3,000-seat cathedral built for vaudeville. Bethlehem Steel, meanwhile, missed every signal. Foreign competition from Japan and Germany, whose newer mills had been rebuilt after the war with American aid, an irony that Baltimore's steel workers noted bitterly. Newer domestic mini-mills that could produce steel cheaper. Aluminum and plastic replacing steel in consumer products. A recession in the early 1980s that cratered demand. The company was slow to modernize, slow to adapt, wedded to the assumption that what had worked for 50 years would work forever. By 1999, the workforce at Sparrows Point had dropped from 30,000 to 3,000. Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2001. The plant changed hands 4 more times. In 2012, the last owners shut it down for good. They blew up the blast furnaces. A man named Larry Bannerman, who grew up in nearby Turner Station, a historically black neighborhood that had been sustained by Sparrows Point paychecks for generations, watched it happen. "We watched the blast furnace where our parents worked be blown up," he said later. "That thing fell over like a big lump, and so did our hearts." The population, which had been 949,708 in 1950, fell to 939,024 in 1960, to 905,759 in 1970, to 786,775 in 1980, to 736,014 in 1990, to 651,154 in 2000, to 620,961 in 2010, to 585,708 in 2020. Each census a smaller number. Each decade a few more row houses boarded up, a few more storefronts dark, a few more blocks where the weeds pushed through the sidewalks. The city lost roughly 40% of its population in 70 years. It dropped from 6th in the nation to 30th. The Belvedere was sold in 1973 to a developer whose rehabilitation plan failed. It was sold again in 1976 to another developer who converted it to condominiums in 1991. You can still drink at the Owl Bar on the ground floor, where Prohibition-era regulars supposedly identified themselves to the bartender by winking at a pair of ceramic owl statues with eyes that blinked back. You can still take the elevator to the 13th floor and look out over the city. The mansard roof is still there, visible from across the harbor, the way Parker and Thomas intended in 1903. But the hotel rooms are gone. The ballrooms are rented for weddings. The throne they brought out for the Queen of Romania is long since dispersed. Lexington Market is still there, too. It burned in 1949, and the atmospheric wooden sheds were replaced with a utilitarian brick building in 1952. In 2022, a $45 million renovation built a new 60,000-square-foot structure with a gabled roofline meant to echo the original market sheds. Fadley's Seafood, which has been operating there since 1886, still sells crab cakes that people drive hours for. The oysters are still shucked by hand, but the Chesapeake's oyster population has fallen to about 2% of its historic levels, and the 100-plus canneries that once lined the harbor are gone, every last one except the old Platt and Company building on Key Highway, which is now the Baltimore Museum of Industry. The B&O Railroad went bankrupt in 1896, was reorganized, and was eventually absorbed into CSX. The Mount Clair Roundhouse is a museum. The Camden Yards Warehouse, a massive 1,116-foot-long brick structure that the B&O built in 1899, stands beyond the right field wall of Oriole Park, which opened in 1992 as the retro-styled ballpark that launched a national trend. The warehouse survived because someone decided it was beautiful enough to keep. Most of the other buildings weren't so lucky. Johns Hopkins, the institution, kept growing. The hospital completed a $1.1 billion expansion in 2012. The university is now the largest private employer in Maryland. The port still operates. It's one of the busiest on the East Coast for automobiles and farm equipment. Where Sparrows Point's blast furnaces once stood, there are now Amazon fulfillment centers and Under Armour distribution warehouses. TradePoint Atlantic, the development company that bought the site, has brought thousands of jobs back to the peninsula. They are not the same jobs. They do not pay the same wages. They do not build neighborhoods the way the mill did. The Hippodrome reopened in 2004 as the France Merrick Performing Arts Center, its interior restored, touring Broadway shows filling the seats. The Lord Baltimore Hotel closed in 1982, was renovated, has changed hands and flags and names, Radisson, Hilton, Radisson again, and still operates at 20 West Baltimore Street, its green copper roof still catching the light. Charles Street runs north from the harbor through Mount Vernon, past the Washington Monument, past the Peabody Library with its 5 tiers of cast-iron balconies and skylit atrium that make it look like something from a dream about libraries, past the Belvedere, up through the neighborhoods and out toward the county line. It was designated a National Scenic Byway. On a spring evening, when the light comes in low and the marble of the monuments goes golden, you can stand on Charles Street and see, for just a moment, what all of those merchants and bankers and bricklayers and steel workers and oyster shuckers were building toward, or what they thought they were building toward. The difference between those two things is the story of every American city. But in Baltimore, it's sharper than most because Baltimore built so much and built it to last and built it out of brick and marble and steel. The materials survived. The city they were meant to hold together didn't, not in the way anyone expected. 45% of Baltimore's housing stock was built before 1940. More than 65,000 buildings are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, more than any other city in the country. Baltimore has more public statues and monuments per capita than anywhere else in America. The bones are all still there, on streets that are quieter now than they were when the trolleys ran and the canneries steamed and the Belvedere ballroom was lit for a queen. The light still comes in the same way through the Peabody Library's skylight. The harbor still opens to the Chesapeake. The door, as they say, is still open.